trying to light your face.
Your face.
I know my face doesn't need to be lit.
Whoa.
Look at that, huh? Okay. Hopefully you all can see it
Yes,
and you can hear me.
yes,
Okay.
but I'm not everybody.
You know what?
Everybody.
That's okay.
Yes, I can hear and see.
All right, great. It's always good to know because I never know what's going on from this end. Okay, oops, let's go back. I've got a touchy keyboard. Okay, so tonight we're going to learn a little bit about Audrey Munson. As I said in the introduction for this talk on Facebook or wherever you saw it on the library, she was the subject. She was a model for much of the a lot of the sculpture, the classical sculpture that you see in New York City and in other cities as well in the early 1900s. And she has a very interesting story. And the way I kind of learned about her was kind of interesting as well. I have a friend, her name's Sonia Livingston, and she writes books very often about local topics, nonfiction books. And she wrote an essay called The Goddess of Ogdensburg, and it was published in a collection called Ladies at the Dreamland about, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. And our book club read it, and I was just so taken with this story about Audrey Munson, who I had never heard of. So I decided I have a son who lives in New York, and on a couple trips down there to see him, I brought my camera and I went searching for Audrey Munson inspired statues. So you'll see some of my pictures here. Some I also gathered from historical sources, and we'll take a little trip to learn who Audrey Munson was. Okay, she was a Rochester native. She was born in 1890, and she had a good long life in Rochester. She didn't stay in Rochester very long. The father left the family when she was fairly young, under 10, I think. Unfortunately, he didn't provide any child support. He never reached out to the family. So they were really kind of obligated to make it on their own, which is very difficult, I'm sure. But Edgar did remarry and raise a second family. Her mother, Kitty, was very close to her and really raised Audrey alone. And it was she was divorced, which was pretty scandalous at the time. So I'm sure it was a difficult time for them. Both of them decided to leave Rochester for New York City, I think mostly for work. And Kitty began to work in a factory sewing corsets. That was her job there. So it's hard to know exactly when Audrey was discovered, but she was discovered young. And at age 17, she did become really a favored model for these sculptors. At this time, say around the early 1900s, it was the end of the Gilded Age, and the Beaux-Arts were in full bloom in New York City. There was a real push to have statuary and buildings built in a classical style, modeled after Europe. So there were a lot of commissions for statuary, both private and public works. And so I mentioned at age 17, that's when Audrey actually kind of came on the scene. Someone noticed her. And she had a fairly long season of being a model. It wasn't really a luxurious job at all. She had to really patiently stand without moving for hours on end for these sculptors. And you get muscle aches and stuff like that. It wasn't an easy job. She also was willing to pose nude with her mother's permission. So that was a little unusual. A lot of times the nude models would be prostitutes or, people who maybe had some disreputable habits, we'll say. but this was not the case with her. And she was quoted at one time as saying that the two dimples on her lower back were as valuable as government bonds, which is kind of interesting. You'll see her dimples. So the real high point of Audrey's life was very young, between 1907 and 1915, till she was about 24. Okay. And it wasn't really due to her looks that she had such a grand fall. It was a lot of other factors. And she was a regular at, the fancy parties and functions. She was invited to a lot of things. She traveled only by limo, so it was said. She dressed very well. She had mink coats and that sort of thing. And she walked New York with these two white greyhounds, evidently, that she was known for. But this was kind of the period of the high point in her life as a model. Some of the names you might or might not recognize as sculptors, but the people who chose to use her as their models include Isadora Conti, Sterling Calder, Daniel Carter French, and you may recognize that name because he sculpted Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial in DC. So when we get to his pieces, you might look and see if there's any similarities between, in the way he handled that subject. Carl Bittner was another name, and Adolf Alexander Weinman. So there aren't a lot of pictures of Audrey, but this is her at age 24. Now, I think she looks much younger than that. She was extremely careful about avoiding the sun, so her skin was probably in very, very good shape. And this photographer, Arnold Gentha, I think it's pronounced, who took this picture, he actually had a whole series of photos that he took of actresses and models in his studio with the studio cat. So they all had the cat in their lap. Okay, so here's the first sculpture I want to talk about a little bit. This is called Pomona, and it's also known as the Roman goddess of abundance. And you can kind of see that with the basket. This is located at the Pulitzer Fountain near the Plaza Hotel, if you know where that is in New York. It's at 5th and 59th, but it's really right on the south edge of Central Park. It's across the street is Central Park. This was designed by Carl Bittner in 1915, but finished by Isadora Conti. And the money for this came from Joseph Pulitzer, as of the Pulitzer Prize. And he died in 1911, but he gave $50,000 for this Pulitzer fountain to be created. And he left instructions to create a fountain like those in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. So again, they were imitating the European fine art at the time. And Mrs. Vanderbilt, actually, the Vanderbilts had an apartment in the plaza, and her bedroom looked out over this particular fountain. And she got so tired, I think, of looking at Audrey's backside, perhaps that she had her bedroom relocated to an inner room. She didn't want to wake up to that. A really huge commission for sculptors was the Panama Pacific International Exhibition, which took place in Oakland, California in 1915. Back in the day, it was like a World's Fair. It was an exhibition of the best of industry, and it showed a lot of progress and art installations of different types. It had more than 19 million visitors actually came to this. And over 1,100 works were inspired by Audrey. Now, these are just a few, but the Star Maiden, the bronze one in the lower right corner there, they used that 95 times just to kind of decorate a roof. That was the figurine used. So this was huge exposure for her and a lot of work for sculptors at the time. Civic Fame is another well-known sculpture in New York City. Now, this is hard to see, and none of these are my photos because I couldn't get them. I think you need a drone to get up there, probably, to get close to it. But this is a 25-foot gilded statue that stands on top of, it's the Manhattan Municipal Building. It's now called the Mayor Dinkins Building, but it's basically the same thing. And this sculpture was commissioned by New York City to celebrate when the 5 boroughs were consolidated into the city of New York. So it's a little bit hard to see. Maybe on the right you can see it a little bit. But she carries a shield that bears the City of New York coat of arms. She's wearing a crown with 5 turrets, which represent the 5 boroughs. And the crown also has dolphins on it as a symbol of New York's maritime setting. So it's a beautiful piece, and it's at 25 feet. It's actually the second largest statue in Manhattan after the Statue of Liberty. But it's so far up on that building, it's hard to see. So, and this is located relatively close. It's lower Manhattan, and it's not too far from the World Trade Center site. This is another one, and this is Daniel Chester French, the guy who did Lincoln. You might see kind of that classic face structure that you see in the Lincoln Memorial in this one as well. And this is called Alma Mater, that he did in 1914. This is located at Columbia University. It's right on their quad in front of the Low Library there. That's on the Upper West Side of Manhattan, getting close to Harlem, which is like 125th Street. This is a bronze cast, and we happened to be there on the day when all the students who were considering going there showed up. So there were people all over the place in groups. So it was kind of hard to get pictures without somebody in them. But, and it said, and I couldn't find this, and I did look, that there's an owl hidden somewhere in her gowns as a sign of wisdom, but I was not able to find the owl. Okay, so in about 1915, Audrey and her mom set out for LA. They decided they'd take a try in making films. And this was the era of silent films, and a lot was being sorted out in terms of what was acceptable and not acceptable at the time. Her first movie was with Thomas Curran in a film called Inspiration, and that's the only one that you can find anything about right now. But she did have, she was in 4 total, but I'm not sure one ever came out. But the other 2 additional films were called Purity and Heedless Moths. And I guess as was typical, she played a silent part as an artist model, as an artist nude model. And at the time, you know, Inspiration was actually the first non-pornographic film that featured a nude artist. But this actually, it was widely banned as being indecent because it had a naked woman in it. And it began a slow but pretty steady downward spiral for Audrey at the very tender age of only 24. So eventually they moved back to New York City. They didn't stay in LA very long. And here are a couple of really well-known statues that have an interesting history. Again, Daniel Chester French did these. The Manhattan Bridge in Lower Manhattan connects Manhattan to Brooklyn. And these 2 statues were mounted on the Brooklyn side of the Manhattan Bridge. They weren't actually on the bridge. And they're representations of the 2 boroughs. In the Manhattan one, and that's the one at the bottom, the one where she almost has an arrogant stance, I think, the way she's sitting there. There are several symbols you can see here. One is she has her foot on a box, and that represents money, symbolizing Manhattan as a great financial center. She's holding a winged globe, which is a symbol of authority. in the one on the right, you can see kind of at her backside, there's some ship motifs there. And that's a symbol of Manhattan being not only an important port, but an international trade hub. And the peacock was usually used to symbolize immortality. And that's there as well. Now, I didn't find anything about that decapitated armless figure there. When I look at that, I think that may have kind of a racial bias to it, but I'm not sure what that is. I didn't find details about that. And then the upper figurine or figure is Brooklyn, Miss Brooklyn, and that's much more calm and poetic. She's got a child reading at her feet. She has a lyre, an instrument to kind of represent culture and education. And then in the back, you can see the part of a church spire to symbolize Brooklyn's spirituality. So these figures were, in the early 1900s, were at the base of the Manhattan Bridge. But then in 1963, Robert Moses he had a big influence with reconstructing a lot of transportation routes in Manhattan and elsewhere. And they moved these when they were revamping the entrance to the Manhattan Bridge from Brooklyn. So now they're located at the Brooklyn Art Museum. These are outside, you can see them, and they're quite impressive. They're pretty big too. They're probably about 10 feet tall. So I had to include this because it's kind of interesting. The postcard at the bottom shows, a depiction of what these look like in the early 1900s. And you can see each of these statues had their own pedestal and sort of like a little pavilion over them. And there's this long ramp going up the bridge. When they redesigned it, it doesn't look like this anymore. First of all, it's a very major thoroughfare, but you can see the bridge there in the photos. And in 2017, they made these replicas, which aren't really very good replicas, I don't think, out of a plastic material, I'm not sure, but they are full size. And they put them on this pedestal, and they actually kind of rotate. They're way above the street and they're lighted at night. So I'm not so impressed with the way they look, but they were trying to give a sense of the history of the place. So another place, there were several, I believe 4 sets of Audrey Munson statues were at the old Penn Station. And that was, they were commissioned by Adolph Alexander Weinman. And literally thousands of people would pass underneath these Audrey Munson figures every single day because Penn Station was just a major hub. You can see in the lower central picture, that's how it looked on Penn. That's a historic photo when it was on Penn Station. And they were called Day and Night. And one of them was sort of holding sunflowers, and the other was kind of shrouded. And in 1963, when they demolished Penn Station rather quickly, these ended up in a dump in New Jersey, along with some of the columns and various other things. And in 1968, they were found. And Night, which is the one that's got the brick background, that was restored. Well, it was restored, and that's also at the Brooklyn Museum. And the Day one, that's kind of what they found in the dump there in the upper right. And it has been, part of it anyway, has been restored and preserved, but I couldn't find out any information about where it is. It's not on any public display yet. So, and then just last month, they opened the new Penn Station, which has some likeness to the old Penn Station. The old Penn Station was a beautiful, huge building with a lot of light coming into it. So there are similarities there, and they did put that in a. It's located in an old post office, a big old post office in New York. And I think it's named after Moynihan, perhaps. Okay, so back to Audrey's story. When they returned to New York from LA after kind of that failed attempt at film, they moved into a boarding house, a Manhattan boarding house that was owned by a Dr. Walter Wilkins. And he took a real liking to Audrey, but she didn't reciprocate. And Audrey and Kitty decided to move to Toronto in 1919. And this coincided with a time when it was discovered that this doctor had killed his wife, Julia, and they found her buried in the backyard of his Long Island home. So because Audrey, she was under suspicion, although there was never a connection, and it was really probably because of her bad reputation and the assumption that there was something going on between the two of them, but there wasn't. It's never proved that happened. Wilkins eventually committed suicide when he was in the Nassau County Jail, but there was a lot of press around this, and it further damaged her reputation, even though it was undeserved. Here are some of the most beautiful depictions, I think, of Audrey Munson. These are in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is on the east side of the park. Again, these are Daniel Chester French's works. The one in marble on the right is called Memory, and the one down below is called Morning Victory. These are actually replicas from private commissions. And there were a lot of private commissions. So Memory was actually a funerary commission from the family of a Boston sculptor named Martin Milmore and his brother. And Morning Victory was a war memorial commissioned for the Melvin family. And it was to commemorate 3 brothers who died in the Civil War. So, but they're absolutely beautiful. Memory, she's holding a mirror. And, it probably represents youth and beauty, both, I'm thinking. Okay, another place you can see Audrey Munson is right in the middle of town at the New York Public Library. That's the one, when you think of the New York Public Library, you think of those 2 big lions sitting out front. But against the building, in kind of these little alcoves, there's one on each side, and on the left side it's called Beauty, and that's Audrey Munson inspired. You can see from my photos they were doing some work, so they had it kind of covered up with a mesh, so I couldn't really remove that in the photos. I tried. And Beauty was done by Frederick McMonnies, I think it's pronounced, and that's around 5th Avenue at East 41st Street if you ever would want to go there. The Frick Museum is actually very close to the Metropolitan Museum on the east side of the park. And Sherry Edmondson Fry did this one, and it's at 1 East 70th Street. The Frick Museum itself is an art museum, and this is a pediment above a door, a fairly large one. It's probably 10 feet. And this is definitely attributed to Audrey Munson. There was a lot of speculation about some of the sculptures, if they were inspired by her, but they don't have definitive proof that they were. So I'm only including the ones in here that they know for sure were inspired by Audrey Munson. This is probably one of my favorites too. This is a memorial. It's actually a small memorial park. It's kind of a wedge-shaped park up not far from Columbia on the west side of the park, probably up in the 70s. No, 106th Street and Broadway. So it's up there. This was done by Augustus Lukeman in 1915. And this commemorates these 2 people, Isidore and Ida Strauss, who perished together on the Titanic. And it's a very cute kind of wedge-shaped garden. It's the streets come in at a strange angle, and it's a small park, but this is really a very evocative sculpture. The Strausses were co-owners of Macy's department store, and they lived about a block south of where this little park is located. And there's an inscription, which is kind of meaningful. It says, "Lovely and pleasant were they in their lives, and in their death they were not parted." And the story goes that Ida chose to stay with her husband when the Titanic went down, and not to go with the women and children in the lifeboats. And now another phase of kind of actually a sad phase of Audrey's life was when she lived in Mexico in upstate New York. Mexico is near, it's a very small town near Oswego. And they moved there and spent a little bit of time in Syracuse as well. And I think this was probably a fairly destitute time for them, living in a rural community with a ruined reputation like Audrey's, but they did the best they could. Kitty acted as a cook, and Audrey sold kitchen utensils door to door. Audrey, at that time, she did write about 20 articles on health and beauty tips for the New York American, a Hearst publication. But at age 31, and remember, this is such a short time for when she kind of started her fall, she did attempt suicide by poisoning. And by age 34, she really started to show signs of mental illness or breakdown. She kind of wore odd clothing. She was known to be roller skating on rural roads, hearing voices, that kind of thing. And they think that they don't really know, but she, I can't remember what the name of it was, but the drug that she chose to try to commit suicide with had mercury in it, which could have done some neurological damage. So they don't really know. It was so long ago. In 1930, she was accused of setting fire to a barn. Again, it wasn't proven, but you know, she just started to fall further and further at this point. This is another pair of Audrey-inspired sculptures. And this is located on Riverside Drive and West 100th Street. It's actually very nice. Riverside Drive has a big park there, big linear park, and it overlooks the Hudson, and it's very treed. So it's a very nice location. And these were done by Attilio Piccirilli. Sounds like it should be pasta, I think. And they're called Sacrifice and Duty, and they're on opposite sides of a very large monument. These are probably 8-foot sculptures, I'm going to say. They're quite large. And it's a memorial to the firefighters who have been lost in the line of duty. Duty is, you can't see all of this because I've cut some of it off, but she's seated next to a fire hydrant, and she's holding a fire helmet and a fireman's coat while holding a child. So that's kind of a mother figure. And then Sacrifice is a woman embracing the body of, we're assuming, her fireman husband, who's killed in the line of duty. And you know, it's quite dramatic, as you can see. It really kind of gets at the heart of this memorial. Okay, there are also sculptures at Columbus Circle and another one in Saratoga Springs, which I'm going to talk about. In Columbus Circle, Columbus Circle is located at Broadway and 59th. It's sort of at the other end of the park from the plaza. It's at the southernmost part, and it is an entrance to the park. And there's a very large monument there that honors the Maine, which was a battleship. There were 258 American soldiers who lost their lives when the Maine exploded in near Havana. And this was an incident that eventually sparked the Spanish-American War. So this is a tribute to them. I kind of had to laugh when I took the picture of the boy there and all the birds, of course, on this sculpture, because he keeps missing his hand. This is I guess it's a thing that they keep replacing it, and they keep taking it off. And these are called Columbia Triumphant is the gilded one on the top of the sculpture. And then Peace is the one lower down. And they're actually kind of on the bow of a ship. And the Spencer Trask Memorial is in Saratoga Springs. There were many Audrey inspired sculptures that were in different locations, but Saratoga was relatively close, so we kind of swung by there. This is Daniel Chester French again, and it's called Spirit of Life. And if you've ever been to Saratoga Springs, as you go into town from the south, I think, and just head up Main Street, you'll see a park to the right. And that's where you'll find this. In fact, it's right off the main street. You head down some stairs, and this is a fountain right there. And this was commissioned to honor a man named Spencer Trask, because he was instrumental in preserving and protecting the healing waters of Saratoga Springs. So that makes sense. This is another, they call it a tablet, that was mounted over, it's currently mounted over the Helen Hayes Theater. Now, the original theater was built in 1912 and was demolished in 1982, but then they rebuilt it and put this tablet on it. And these are definitely Audrey Munson inspired as well. There's a picture there, not by me, of what the theater looks like now, but that's in the theater district, very close to Times Square. An interesting fact about this Helen Hayes theater was it was the site of the original tapings of the Merv Griffin show before it moved to LA. So who knew? And the last chapter really in Audrey's life, and it was a long chapter, was she eventually, as she was nearing age 40, she was court mandated to seek care at a state asylum up in Ogdensburg, New York, which is way up there. It's way up near Canada. There was not a clear diagnosis. Maybe there couldn't have been at the time, but she was at Point Airy, was the name of the place, for 65 years. She lived to be 104.
Oh, wow.
Which is a tremendous time if you think about it, and all the changes that happened during that time. And when she went into the asylum, asylums have a terrible reputation, but at the time she went in, they were really kind of benevolent places meant to heal people. They had, they wanted people to exercise in fresh air. They had a healthy diet. They had all kinds of social activities and gardens and music, lectures, church services and games. So it wasn't the terrible places that we heard about until a little later. And it wasn't really till the 1940s that drugs and shock therapy were introduced here. But she had a heck of a long part of her life at this institution. She's buried in her family plot in New Haven, Connecticut. And for a long time, there was no stone to mark her grave site. There was just sometimes they have just a stick sort of in the ground with the person's name on it that the funeral home will supply, and that was it. And you can see it's a very modest stone. And they do have a historical marker there, although the birth date is off by a year. She was born in 1890. So that's kind of the end of her story, although she certainly lives on in all these amazing sculptures in New York City. You can do a walking, well, maybe a taxi tour of New York to see all these different places. And if you'd like to learn more about it, I would highly recommend the essay by Sonia Livingston in her book, Ladies at the Dreamland, called The Goddess of Ogdensburg. It summarizes a lot of what I said in a very enjoyable form. And there's a book called The Curse of Beauty, which came out just a few years ago by James Bone, which I read, and that gets into more detail too, and also explores his exploration of her life, which there are a lot of questions about her life, particularly when she was in Ogdensburg. So you might want to pick that up if you find this interesting. So, okay, well, I don't want to go back to you guys.
So was there any connection of her family name to the art museum in Utica?
I don't think so.
I'm trying to think of the name of the museum. It's like Munson William Proctor, or Proctor William Munson, or
Yeah, I know.
some. something like that. I know
Yeah,
it's a really good museum and it's free. It's,
right, right. Yeah, I'm not sure about that.